Alright, let's go. Number 10. The Klerksdorp Spheres. Deep in the pyrophyllite mines of Ottosdal, South Africa, miners have been pulling small metallic objects out of the rock for over a century. The spheres are not large. Most range between 1 and 4 inches in diameter, small enough to sit in a closed hand, light enough to carry in a pocket. They have a dark, bluish-red metallic sheen that catches light the way a polished bearing does. Some of them, the ones that have made these objects famous, carry 3 crisp parallel grooves cut around their equators, evenly spaced, geometrically precise, running in unbroken parallel lines across a curved surface. That alone would make them a curiosity. What makes them something else entirely is the rock they came out of. The pyrophyllite deposits at Ottosdal have been dated to approximately 2.8 billion years old. That number is almost impossible to hold in a human mind. So consider what it excludes. It excludes humans. It excludes mammals. It excludes dinosaurs. It excludes fish. It excludes plants. It excludes every multicellular organism that has ever existed on Earth. At 2.8 billion years, life on this planet consisted of single-celled microbes drifting in shallow oceans under an atmosphere that would have killed anything more complex within minutes. The rock surrounding these spheres formed in a world without eyes to see it, and without hands to shape anything within it. And yet the spheres are there, embedded, sealed inside the matrix as if the stone itself had crystallized around them. The mainstream geological explanation is that they are natural concretions, mineral nodules composed primarily of hematite and wollastonite that formed through ordinary sedimentary processes as ions precipitated around a central nucleus over geological time. Concretions are real. They occur in sedimentary formations across the planet. The explanation is scientifically sound and almost certainly correct for the majority of specimens. But here's where the standard explanation begins to strain against the object itself. Concretions do not typically produce 3 parallel grooves of equal depth running around a sphere's equator. Concretions do not produce surfaces that gleam like worked metal. Concretions form lumps, irregular masses, and rough nodules. The Klerksdorp spheres, at their most striking, look manufactured. They look like ball bearings pressed out of a die. They look like something that was made. Geologists who have examined them note that the grooves correspond to layering planes in the surrounding pyrophyllite, that the apparent metallic sheen is a function of mineral composition rather than polish, that the sphericity is not as perfect as proponents of an artificial origin claim. The debate continues in mineralogy journals and museum collections, and the conventional answer remains intact. They are concretions. Strange, beautiful, statistically unlikely concretions, but concretions. The truly unsettling aspect is not whether the spheres were made. It is what their existence forces us to confront. An object emerges from a stratum laid down before complex life. A handful of specimens have features so suggestive of design that they have to be argued away in technical language. The conversation itself, the necessity of the conversation, places these small, metallic-looking orbs at the very edge of what the geological record is supposed to permit. They sit now in museum drawers in Klerksdorp and in private collections around the world. Small, heavy, banded with their 3 impossible lines, pulled from rock that predates the eye that examines them by a margin so vast that the question of who could have made them, if anyone, has no candidate to offer. The stone remembers nothing. The spheres do not explain themselves. Number 9. The stone spheres of Costa Rica. In the 1930s, workers for the United Fruit Company clearing jungle in the Derinkuyu Delta of southern Costa Rica began uncovering something the land had been hiding for centuries. Stone balls. Dozens of them at first, then hundreds, scattered through the rainforest soil and the banana plantations being carved out of it. Some were small enough to lift with 2 hands. Others were taller than the men standing beside them and required teams of laborers with chains and tractors to move. The workers, under instructions to clear the land for planting, rolled them aside, broke them open, looking for gold, dynamited the largest ones to fragments. By the time archaeologists arrived to study them, the damage was done. Whatever pattern the spheres had once formed across the delta was gone. The arrangements had been erased before anyone thought to record them. What remained was the geometry itself, and the geometry was impossible. The spheres were carved between 600 and 1500 CE by the people archaeologists now call the Derinkuyu culture. They range from a few inches in diameter to over 8 feet across. The largest weighs 16 tons. They were not shaped from sandstone or limestone or any of the softer rocks that yield to hand tools. They were carved from gabbro, a hard igneous rock formed from cooled magma deep within the earth, a stone so dense and unyielding that modern masons would reach for diamond-tipped equipment before attempting it. The Derinkuyu had no metal tools, no iron, no bronze, no hardened steel. They had stone hammers and water and time, and yet the spheres are nearly perfect. Surveys of the surviving examples have measured their sphericity to within 2 centimeters of mathematical perfection, on a sphere 8 feet across, sitting in a jungle clearing. 1,200 years ago, the deviation from a true sphere is smaller than the width of a human finger. The surfaces are smooth. The curvature is uniform in every direction. They look less like objects carved by hand than like objects extruded by some process the carver shouldn't have possessed. But here's where the conventional explanation falls apart. The standard archaeological account holds that the spheres were produced by patient percussive shaping, followed by grinding with abrasive sand and water over months or years per object. The mathematics of this technique cannot be ruled out. What cannot be explained is the consistency. Hundreds of spheres, carved by different hands across centuries, scattered across a delta the size of a small province, all converging on the same impossible standard of precision. This isn't the signature of trial and error. This is the signature of a method, codified and transmitted, refined until it became routine, and we have no idea what the method was. No tools have been recovered, no workshops, no half-finished spheres abandoned mid-shaping that might reveal the technique. The Derinkuyu left no writing, and the Spanish chroniclers who arrived in the 16th century found a population already in collapse, their oral traditions dissolving before they could be transcribed. The purpose is equally vanished. Some of the spheres were aligned in straight lines. Some sat in geometric clusters near elite burials. Some were positioned in what may have been astronomical arrangements pointing towards solstice sunrises. We will never know for certain, because the United Fruit Company moved them before anyone thought to map them. The pattern that might have told us what the Derinkuyu were doing was treated as an inconvenience and bulldozed into the soil. What remains are the spheres themselves, dark gray-green and lichen-stained, sitting now in museum lawns and government plazas and the front yards of private homes across Costa Rica. They are perfect. They are silent. And the people who made them, working hard stone with harder patience, left no record of how or why. Number 8. The Nazca lines. Between approximately 500 BCE and 500 CE, on a high desert plateau in southern Peru, a civilization began drawing on the earth itself. Not on cave walls, not on pottery, not on the surfaces a human eye could survey from standing height. They drew on the ground at a scale that could only be comprehended from the sky, and they did so for 1,000 years. The Nazca culture inhabited one of the driest places on the planet. The pampas between the Andean foothills and the Pacific coast receive almost no rainfall, experience minimal wind erosion, and bake under a sun that has barely shifted in intensity for millennia. The desert surface is a thin layer of reddish-brown pebbles, oxidized by exposure, sitting atop lighter, paler ground. To create a line, the Nazca simply removed the dark pebbles and exposed the surface beneath. To create 800 lines, 300 geometric figures, and 70 depictions of animals and plants. They did this across 170 square miles of open desert, an area larger than many modern cities, transformed into a single continuous artwork. The figures defy comprehension at ground level. A hummingbird stretches over 300 feet from beak to tail. A monkey curls its spiral tail across a span larger than a football field. A spider, a condor, a pelican, a humanoid figure that researchers have called the astronaut, all of them rendered at scales reaching 1,200 feet across. Standing inside one of these designs, a person sees nothing but a shallow groove in the desert pavement. The figure is invisible. The composition is invisible. The artistry is invisible. To see what the Nazca made, you have to leave the ground. The numbers are staggering, but the geometry is worse. The lines are straight across distances of miles. The curves are smooth across spans larger than stadiums. The proportions of the animal figures are anatomically accurate, the limbs correctly scaled, the heads correctly positioned. The Nazca executed these designs with a precision that suggests external reference. Yet the only vantage from which their work resolves into coherence is hundreds of feet above the desert floor. The preservation is equally improbable. The atmospheric stillness of the Nazca Plateau, combined with the desert's near-zero humidity, has held these lines in place for 2,000 years. The same artwork drawn in almost any other landscape on Earth would have been erased within a generation. But here's where the standard explanation falls apart. The conventional account proposes that the Nazca used ropes, wooden stakes, and proportional scaling from smaller templates to lay out their designs. This is plausible for the straight lines. It is mechanically possible for the geometric shapes. It becomes increasingly difficult to defend when applied to the curved organic figures of animals rendered correctly across distances at which the artists themselves could not verify their work. The Nazca had no balloons, no towers tall enough to provide aerial perspective, no mountains positioned to give an overhead view of the plateau. They were, by every reconstruction we can make of their technology, working blind to the only vantage from which their work was meant to be seen. The implications extend further than the engineering puzzle. Whatever the Nazca were communicating, the audience was not human at ground level. Whatever observer they were addressing existed in a position the Nazca themselves could not occupy. Some researchers have proposed astronomical alignments. Others have suggested the figures were processional paths, walked in ritual rather than viewed in totality. Others have proposed water rituals tied to the underground aquifers of the region. None of these explanations accounts for why the figures had to be anatomically correct from a vantage no human possessed. The Nazca civilization collapsed sometime after 500 CE, likely due to climate stress and the deforestation of the huarango trees that anchored the desert's fragile ecosystem. The people who drew the lines are gone. Their language, their cosmology, their understanding of what they were making and for whom, all of it dissolved into the dry pampas they spent 1,000 years inscribing. The lines remain, visible only from above, drawn by hands that could not see them. Number 7. Derinkuyu Underground City. In 1963, a man in the Cappadocia region of central Turkey was renovating the basement of his home when he swung a hammer at a wall that shouldn't have been there. The wall gave way. Behind it was a passage leading down into the dark. He had no idea what he had found. Neither did the archaeologists who arrived in the weeks that followed. What lay beneath that ordinary Turkish house was not a cellar, not a tomb, not a forgotten storeroom. It was a city. Derinkuyu descends 280 feet into the volcanic bedrock of the Anatolian Plateau. 18 levels stacked vertically beneath the surface, connected by narrow passages and steep shafts, branching into chambers carved with deliberate purpose. The complex could shelter an estimated 20,000 people, not refugees in temporary hiding, permanent inhabitants with livestock stabled on the upper levels, wineries pressing grapes in the middle depths, schools where children learned, chapels where the population worshipped, kitchens, granaries, communal dining halls, and storage chambers capable of feeding the entire population for months. An entire urban civilization folded downward into the rock. The construction material was soft volcanic tuff, ash compacted by ancient eruptions into stone that can be worked with relatively simple tools. But softness is not the same as ease. The volume of material removed to create Derinkuyu is staggering. Hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of stone excavated by hand, hauled to the surface, and disposed of somewhere we have never identified. Where the spoil went remains unknown. The builders erased their own evidence. The dating is uncertain in the way that all truly ancient construction is uncertain. The most widely accepted estimates place the earliest excavations in the 8th century BCE under the Phrygians, the Iron Age culture that occupied central Anatolia before the rise of the Persian Empire. Other researchers push the origins further back into prehistory, arguing that the deepest levels show techniques and patterns that predate any Phrygian construction we can verify elsewhere. The city was expanded, modified, and re-inhabited across millennia, used by Christians fleeing Roman persecution, then by Byzantines hiding from Arab raids, then sealed and forgotten until a hammer broke through a basement wall in 1963. The engineering is what refuses to make sense. Derinkuyu contains over 50 vertical ventilation shafts, some descending the full 280 feet from surface to the deepest level. The shafts draw fresh air down through the complex and exhaust stale air upward, creating circulation patterns that keep oxygen levels stable even on the 18th level, where 20,000 people, livestock, cooking fires, and oil lamps would otherwise have suffocated within hours. The system was designed with an understanding of thermal differentials, air pressure, and the behavior of gases in enclosed spaces. It still functions today. Tourists walking the deepest accessible levels breathe air that arrives through shafts cut by hands that may have worked the stone 2,800 years ago. Then there are the doors. Massive circular stones, some up to 5 feet in diameter, set into recesses carved alongside the main passages. The doors could be rolled across the corridors from the inside, sealing entire sections of the city behind walls of solid rock that no attacker could move from the outside. Each door weighs hundreds of kilograms. Each was positioned so that a small number of defenders could close it while a larger force on the surface could not open it. The architecture is not residential. It is defensive in a way that approaches paranoia. But here's where Derinkuyu becomes genuinely disturbing. You do not carve a city 280 feet into solid rock to escape weather. You do not install rolling stone doors and choke points and multi-level seals to hide from ordinary enemies. Every feature of Derinkuyu's architecture suggests it was built to hide its inhabitants from an external threat severe enough, persistent enough, and dangerous enough to justify removing hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of stone by hand. Whoever built this was afraid of something, afraid enough to take an entire civilization underground and engineer it to survive there indefinitely. And Derinkuyu is not alone. The same region of Cappadocia contains over 200 underground complexes of varying scale. At least 40 of them descend to comparable depths. Some are connected by tunnels stretching for kilometers between cities. The pattern is consistent. A population, or successive populations, decided that the surface of central Anatolia was not safe, and that the only solution was to disappear beneath it. The ventilation shafts still draw air. The stone doors still sit in their recesses, ready to roll. The chambers still wait in the dark beneath a Turkish landscape that gives no hint of what lies below. And nowhere in the historical record does anyone explain what the builders were hiding from. Number 6. The Saqqara bird. In 1898, during excavations at the necropolis of Saqqara south of Cairo, French archaeologists working in a tomb dated to roughly 200 BCE pulled from the dust a small wooden object that no one quite knew how to catalog. It was labeled a bird figurine, assigned a museum number, and placed among the hundreds of other ceremonial trinkets that the dry sands of Egypt have preserved for 2,000 years. For 7 decades, it sat in storage in Cairo, unremarkable, unstudied, indistinguishable from the funerary clutter of an entire civilization. Then, someone looked at it again. The object is small, roughly 5.6 inches long, with a wingspan of about 7 inches, carved from a single piece of sycamore wood. It weighs 39 grams. That is less than a chicken egg. Less than 2 tablespoons of water. An object so light it could rest on an open palm without registering as weight. But the proportions are wrong. Bird figurines from ancient Egypt number in the thousands. They depict falcons, ibises, vultures, swallows. They are stylized, ceremonial, religiously freighted. They have legs. They have feathers carved into the wood. They have eyes. The Saqqara object has none of these. It has no legs. It has no carved plumage. Its wings are not folded in the resting posture of a perched bird or extended in the splayed posture of a hieroglyph. They are straight, level, and slightly angled downward at the tips in a configuration that aerodynamic engineers recognize immediately. The cross-section of the wings is not flat. It is curved on top and flatter on the bottom. The profile of a modern airfoil. And then there is the tail. Birds, as a matter of biological fact, do not have vertical tail fins. Their tails fan horizontally. Every bird figurine in the Egyptian catalog reflects this. The Saqqara object does not. It has a vertical stabilizer rising at a right angle from its body, the precise configuration found on every fixed-wing aircraft built in the 20th century. There is no biological model for this feature. There is no religious precedent for it. It is not how Egyptians depicted birds. It is how engineers depict gliders. In 1969, the Egyptian physician and amateur Egyptologist Khalil Masiha pulled the object from a museum drawer and made the connection that the original excavators had missed. He proposed that the Saqqara bird was not a figurine at all. He proposed it was a scale model of a glider. Subsequent wind tunnel tests by aerospace researchers have shown that the proportions do generate lift. Replicas, when launched, glide. They glide poorly. They glide briefly, but they glide. Mainstream Egyptology rejects the interpretation. The consensus position holds that the object is a ceremonial representation of a bird, possibly the god Horus, possibly a weather vane mounted on a temple mast, possibly a child's toy. The vertical tail fin, they argue, is incidental. The airfoil curvature is incidental. The absence of legs and feathers is stylistic shorthand. The aerodynamic competence of the design is coincidence. This may be true. The evidence does not compel any single reading. But here is what the debate cannot dissolve. Someone in Egypt, more than 2,000 years ago, carved a piece of sycamore wood into a shape that, by accident or by intent, obeys the laws of flight. The shape exists. The object sits today in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, 39 grams of pale wood behind glass, holding within its proportions a question that no one has answered. Whether the hand that shaped it understood what it had made, we will never know. Number 5. Puma Punku. High in the Bolivian Andes, on a windswept plateau, 12,800 feet above sea level, lies a field of broken stone that should not exist. The air here is thin enough to leave visitors lightheaded within minutes. Trees do not grow at this altitude. The soil is poor, the wind is constant, and the sun in the dry season is merciless. This is not a place ancient civilizations should have chosen to attempt the most precise stonework in the prehistoric world. And yet they did. Puma Punku is part of the Tiwanaku complex, a sprawling ceremonial center whose construction began around 536 CE, though some researchers argue for considerably earlier dates buried beneath the consensus. The site has been cataloged, photographed, scanned, and measured for over a century. The blocks have been examined by archaeologists, engineers, geologists, and stonemasons. The conclusions, when stated plainly, do not align with what mainstream history says the builders were capable of. The stones are made of andesite and diorite. These are among the hardest igneous rocks on Earth. Diorite in particular sits near the upper end of the geological hardness scale, harder than the iron tools used in most of the ancient world, and significantly harder than the bronze and copper available to pre-Columbian Andean cultures. The builders of Puma Punku did not, according to the archaeological record, possess iron. They did not possess the wheel. They did not possess draft animals capable of hauling massive loads across mountainous terrain. They did not, by any standard accounting of their toolkit, possess the means to do what they did. The largest stones at Puma Punku weigh up to 130 tons. To put that number in physical terms, a single block is roughly the weight of 15 adult African elephants compressed into one piece of rock. These blocks were transported from quarries located over 50 miles away. The route crosses uneven highland terrain, river valleys, and elevation changes that would defeat modern wheeled vehicles. How the stones moved across that distance is unknown. No road suitable for such loads has been identified. No record exists of the labor force that performed the transport. The blocks simply arrived. What they did with the blocks once they arrived is harder to accept than how they moved them. The stones at Puma Punku are cut with a precision that does not belong to the era assigned to them. Joints fit together without mortar, the faces meeting so closely that a sheet of paper cannot be slipped between them. H-shaped blocks interlock like industrial puzzle pieces, with notches and tongues machined into the rock at perfect right angles. The interior surfaces of these notches are flat to within fractions of a millimeter. Holes are drilled into the stone with parallel walls and consistent diameters, as if produced by a rotary bit advancing at controlled pressure. Right-angle cuts meet at corners so sharp they appear to have been finished by a milling machine. This is the language of modern fabrication. It is the language of CNC routers, of diamond-tipped saws, of laser-aligned cutting tables. It is not the language of hand tools striking stone in the thin air of the Andes 1,500 years ago. The standard explanation is that the builders used harder stone hammers, abrasive sand, copper chisels, and enormous quantities of time and labor. Experimental archaeologists have demonstrated that, given enough years, hand methods can produce flat surfaces and tight joints. What the experiments have not demonstrated is the reproduction of Puma Punku's precision at scale, with the consistency seen across hundreds of blocks, in the geometry that survives at the site. The gap between what experimental archaeology can achieve and what the builders actually produced remains uncomfortably wide. And then there is the chosen material. If the goal was monumental construction, softer stones were available in the region. Sandstone, limestone, basalt, all of these would have served the ceremonial function. The builders selected the hardest rocks they could find. They chose diorite. They chose andesite. They chose to make their task as nearly impossible as the geology of the Altiplano would permit. The implications are staggering. Whoever planned Puma Punku wanted the stones to last in a way that softer materials could not. They wanted the precision to hold. They wanted the joints to remain locked together long after the civilization that placed them had vanished from the plateau. Today, the site is a ruin. Earthquakes have toppled the blocks. Centuries of looting have scattered them. Spanish colonizers broke pieces apart looking for buried treasure that did not exist. What survives is a field of geometric fragments lying in the high grass, their cuts still crisp, their drilled holes still circular, their right angles still meeting at 90 degrees. Modern stonemasons who visit the site often grow quiet. They have spent their careers working stone. They understand what they are looking at. They understand what it would take to produce these shapes with the tools available in 536 CE. and they understand that the explanation they are expected to accept does not close the gap between the evidence and the era. The plateau wind moves through the broken stones. The sun rises and sets over the altiplano. The blocks remain where they fell, locked into geometries that no one can fully explain, waiting for an answer that has not yet been written. Number 4. The Longyou Caves. In 1992, in a village called Xianbeikun in eastern China's Zhejiang province, a farmer decided to pump out what he and his neighbors had assumed for generations was a bottomless pond. The water never seemed to drain. The locals called such ponds no-bottom ponds and avoided them. This particular farmer had grown tired of the mystery. He brought in pumps and began draining. The pond was not a pond. It was the flooded entrance to a chamber the size of a cathedral. Beneath the water, the villager and the investigators who followed him found a vast artificial cavern hollowed out of solid siltstone. Then another beside it. Then another. By the time the surveying was finished, 24 enormous chambers had been confirmed, each one carved by human hands into the bedrock beneath rice paddies that had been farmed for 2,000 years without anyone above ground suspecting what lay beneath their feet. The dating placed construction at no later than 212 BCE, during the final years of the Warring States period, or the earliest decades of the Qin dynasty. The caverns may be older. Nothing rules out an earlier origin. What can be said with certainty is that by the time the first emperor was unifying China, these chambers already existed. The scale resists easy comprehension. Each chamber rises up to 100 feet from floor to ceiling. The internal pillars are precisely cut, angled to bear load. The walls slope inward with deliberate geometry, and every surface, every wall, every ceiling, every pillar is covered in perfectly parallel chisel marks running in tight diagonal rows. Not random scarring from haphazard quarrying. A consistent rhythmic pattern executed across thousands of square meters of stone. The marks are uniform in depth, uniform in spacing, uniform in angle. Whoever made them was working to a specification. The total volume of stone removed from the 24 chambers exceeds 1 million cubic meters. That figure deserves to sit on the page alone for a moment. 1 million cubic meters of siltstone extracted by hand from beneath the surface of the earth, in an age before mechanized excavation existed anywhere on the planet. Engineering estimates suggest that carving a single chamber would have required over 1,000 workers laboring for approximately 6 years. 24 chambers. The arithmetic produces numbers that strain belief. Tens of thousands of laborers. Decades of continuous excavation. A workforce comparable to the construction of the Great Pyramid operating beneath the soil of eastern China. But here is where the silence becomes its own horror. There is no record. Not a single ancient text mentions the Longyou caves. No imperial chronicle, no provincial gazetteer, no Taoist scripture, no local legend, no carved inscription anywhere on the walls. Chinese civilization produced one of the most meticulous bureaucratic traditions in human history. Tax records survive. Census records survive. Records of canal dredgings and granary inventories and minor provincial appointments survive. A project requiring tens of thousands of workers over multiple generations should have left a documentary footprint visible from orbit. It left nothing. The Longyou caves do not appear in the historical record at all. They are not mentioned by Sima Qian, who chronicled everything else of consequence in the era of their probable construction. They are not mentioned by any subsequent dynasty's archivists. The villagers who farmed directly above them for 2 millennia did not know they were there. The caverns were forgotten so completely that the only memory of them was a folk warning to avoid certain ponds, whose water never seemed to leave. And there is a further problem, one that the conventional explanations have never resolved. Where the spoil went remains unknown. 1 million cubic meters of extracted siltstone has to go somewhere. It has to be hauled to the surface, transported, dumped, piled, repurposed. The surrounding landscape shows no quarry tailings consistent with the volume removed. No spoil heaps, no fill terraces, no record of construction projects elsewhere in the region that consumed the missing stone. The material was extracted, and then it vanished from the landscape as completely as the memory of the people who extracted it. What were the chambers for? Tomb complexes leave grave goods. Quarries leave geological signatures consistent with commercial extraction. Military bunkers leave defensive architecture. The Longyou caves leave only the chisel marks and the silence. They were sealed, flooded, and forgotten by the very civilization that supposedly built them, and the lights that now illuminate their interiors fall on tool patterns made by hands that left no other trace of having existed. Number 3. The Baghdad Battery. In 1936, near the village of Kujut Rabu, just outside Baghdad, a small ceramic jar was recovered from the soil of what had once been the eastern frontier of the Parthian world. It was unremarkable at first glance. Roughly 5 inches tall, terracotta, the kind of vessel that turns up by the hundreds across every excavation in Mesopotamia. The artifact was catalogued, set aside, and might have remained a footnote in a museum drawer indefinitely. Then, someone looked inside. What the jar contained should not have existed in a context dated to somewhere between 200 BCE and 250 CE. A copper cylinder, rolled and soldered into a tube, sat inside the ceramic body. Suspended within the copper was an iron rod, isolated from the surrounding metal, and sealed in place with a stopper of bitumen, a deliberate asphalt plug whose only function was to hold the components in fixed relation to each other. The iron showed corrosion, consistent with prolonged exposure to an acidic substance. The copper showed the chemical scarring of electrolytic activity. Every element of the assembly was configured in precisely the arrangement that, in any modern physics laboratory, produces a current. The implication arrived slowly, then all at once, filled with vinegar, lemon juice, or grape must, all liquids freely available in the Parthian and Sasanian worlds. The device generates approximately 1.1 volts of electricity. Not theoretically. Actually, modern researchers have built replicas from the published dimensions and measured the output with standard voltmeters. The American television program Mythbusters constructed a working example on camera and registered current. University laboratories have repeated the experiment with the same result. The Baghdad jar is not a battery in metaphor. It is a battery in function, and it was built nearly 2,000 years before a battery was supposed to exist. The accepted history of electricity begins in 1800, when the Italian physicist Alessandro Volta stacked alternating discs of copper and zinc separated by brine-soaked cloth and demonstrated a sustained electrical current to the Royal Society. This is the founding moment of electrochemistry. Every textbook, every curriculum, every history of science treats the voltaic pile as the origin point, the instant when humanity first generated electrical power on demand. The Baghdad artifact predates this moment by approximately 1900 years. The function remains contested. Some researchers have proposed that the device was used for electroplating, the application of thin layers of gold or silver onto base metal objects through electrochemical deposition. Plated artifacts from the broader region have been cited as circumstantial evidence, though the metallurgical pathways are disputed. Others have suggested medical applications. Mild electrical current applied to the body for pain relief or therapeutic stimulation, a practice for which the Greek physician Scribonius Largus left written instructions in the 1st century CE, recommending the electric torpedo fish for headaches and gout. If the jar served a similar purpose, it represents the earliest known instance of deliberate, generated, applied electricity in human history. The mainstream archaeological position remains cautious. The artifact may have functioned as a storage vessel for sacred scrolls, with the metals serving a protective or ritual purpose. The corrosion may be incidental. The voltage production may be a coincidence of geometry. These are reasonable counter-arguments. They are not, however, capable of explaining why someone in the Parthian world assembled copper, iron, and an acidic seal in the exact configuration required to produce a current, and then sealed it shut with bitumen as if the contents were meant to be retained. What makes the Baghdad battery particularly unsettling is what it does to the timeline. The Longyou caverns suggest that someone, somewhere, was capable of monumental engineering we cannot document. The Baghdad jar suggests something worse: that the discoveries we treat as foundational pillars of modern civilization, the harnessing of electricity, the conversion of chemistry into power, may have been arrived at, used, and forgotten, more than once, by people whose names we will never recover. The jar still sits in storage. The corrosion is still on the iron. The bitumen seal is still intact. Number 2. The Antikythera mechanism, the computer that shouldn't have existed for 1,000 years. In October 1900, a team of Greek sponge divers seeking shelter from a storm anchored off the rocky coast of the island of Antikythera in the eastern Mediterranean. When the weather cleared, they descended into the deep water around the island and found a Roman-era shipwreck scattered across the seabed at a depth of approximately 45 meters. Among the bronze statues, amphorae, and corroded artifacts they hauled to the surface over the following months was an unremarkable lump of fused metal and wood about the size of a shoebox. It was set aside in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens and largely ignored. The treasures from the wreck, the marble figures, the glass vessels, the coins, drew the attention of scholars and visitors. The corroded lump did not. It would take more than half a century before anyone understood what the divers had actually recovered. The object dates to between 100 and 150 BCE. It is a hand-cranked analog computer. It contains at least 30 precision bronze gears meshed together inside a wooden case, each tooth cut to mathematical specifications that allowed the device to model the motion of the heavens. A user turned a small crank on the side of the case, and dials on the front and back faces rotated to display astronomical positions decades into the future or the past. It predicted solar and lunar eclipses with calendrical precision. It tracked the irregular orbit of the moon, compensating for the variable speed at which the moon moves across the sky, a phenomenon that requires sophisticated mathematics to model. It tracked the motions of the known planets. It counted down the 4-year cycle of the ancient Olympic Games on a dedicated dial, naming the festivals in sequence. Read that again. A bronze machine, hand-cranked, recovered from a Mediterranean shipwreck 2,000 years old, contained a dedicated dial for the Olympics. The first researcher to seriously study the artifact was the Greek admiral and scholar Konstantinos Rhodos in 1902, who noticed inscriptions and gear teeth beneath the corrosion. But it was the British physicist and historian Derek de Solla Price at Yale University who, beginning in the 1950s and culminating in his landmark 1974 paper, Gears from the Greeks, demonstrated through X-ray imaging that the device was not a navigational instrument or a decorative astrolabe. It was a calculator. Subsequent imaging using high-resolution computed tomography conducted by the Antikythera Mechanism Research Project beginning in 2005 revealed thousands of Greek characters of inscription on the device's surfaces, an instruction manual etched into the metal, and confirmed the function of gear trains that Price had only been able to guess at. The mechanism is now understood to be the most sophisticated single object surviving from the ancient world. But here's where the conventional history of technology collapses. Nothing of comparable mechanical complexity appears in the archaeological or historical record again for more than 1,000 years. The astronomical clocks of medieval Europe, built in cathedral towers across the 14th century, are the next devices that approach what the Antikythera mechanism was already doing in the 2nd century BCE. Between the wreck off Antikythera and the clock at Salisbury Cathedral lies a gap of over a millennium, during which the knowledge required to build such a device was, by every available measure, lost. The Greeks possessed it. The Romans inherited fragments of it. and then it vanished from human civilization so completely that historians for centuries assumed it had never existed at all. What makes this artifact particularly disturbing is the question it forces. A device this refined did not emerge from a single workshop. It is the product of a tradition, generations of artisans, mathematicians, and astronomers iterating on a design that must have had precursors and successors. None of those precursors have ever been found. None of the successors have ever been found. We have one machine, dredged from a single shipwreck by sponge divers sheltering from a storm. If that ship had sunk in deeper water, or had been salvaged in antiquity, or had simply gone down somewhere the divers never went, we would have no evidence that the technology had ever existed. The greenish-blue lump still sits in Athens. The gear teeth, faintly visible through the corrosion, still mesh in the positions where a Greek craftsman set them more than 2,000 years ago. How many other machines stood on shelves in libraries that burned, in workshops that were razed, in cities that the sea has since swallowed, is a question the corroded bronze cannot answer. Number 1. Gobekli Tepe. In 1994, a Kurdish shepherd tending his flock on a dusty hilltop in southeastern Turkey noticed something strange protruding from the soil. A piece of carved stone, weathered smooth by millennia of wind, jutting from the earth at an angle no plow had ever made. The shepherd mentioned it to local authorities. Word reached a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt, who had been searching the region for exactly this kind of anomaly. When Schmidt arrived and began surveying the hill, he understood within hours that the standard timeline of human civilization was about to break. What lay beneath that hilltop was not a temple. It was a complex of temples, ringed in circular enclosures, carved from honey-colored limestone, and buried with deliberate care by the people who built it. T-shaped pillars 18 feet tall, some weighing up to 20 tons, stood in concentric arrangements like silent congregations. Their surfaces were covered in intricately carved reliefs. Foxes mid-leap, snakes coiled in spirals, vultures with outstretched wings, scorpions frozen in attack, lions rendered with the confidence of artists who had spent lifetimes studying their subjects. The radiocarbon dates returned numbers that should have been impossible. Approximately 9,600 BCE, roughly 6,000 years older than Stonehenge, roughly 7,000 years older than the Egyptian pyramids, older than writing, older than pottery, older than the wheel, older, most disturbingly, than agriculture itself. The numbers defy comprehension. For more than a century, the standard model of human civilization had rested on a sequence so foundational it appeared in every introductory textbook. Hunter-gatherers domesticated plants. Agriculture produced surplus food. Surplus food produced sedentary populations. Sedentary populations produced cities. Cities produced organized religion and monumental architecture. The arrow ran in one direction only. Farming first, temples last. Gobekli Tepe inverted the entire sequence. The people who quarried 20-ton limestone pillars from bedrock, transported them across a landscape without draft animals, carved them with anatomically precise reliefs, and arranged them in concentric circles on a hilltop were not farmers. They were hunter-gatherers. They had no pottery. They had no metal. They had no written language to coordinate the labor, no granaries to feed the workforce, no domesticated animals to share the load. They built a sanctuary that required organized cooperation on a scale historians had assumed impossible for their stage of development. And they did it before anyone on Earth had planted a field. But here's where the discovery becomes genuinely disturbing. The wild grasses growing on the slopes around Gobekli Tepe include the ancestors of einkorn wheat. Genetic studies have traced the origin of domesticated einkorn to a site less than 20 miles from the temple complex, within the same window of time. The implication that emerges from this geography is the most subversive idea in modern archaeology. Agriculture may not have produced religion. Religion may have produced agriculture. The need to feed the workers who gathered to build and maintain a sacred site may have been the pressure that drove the first deliberate cultivation of grain. The first farms may have existed to support the first temple, not the other way around. What makes this site particularly haunting is what its builders did when they were finished with it. They did not abandon Gobekli Tepe. They did not leave it to weather. They buried it, deliberately, carefully, filling the enclosures with rubble and earth until the pillars disappeared beneath an artificial hill. Whatever the complex meant to them, whatever it asked of them, they decided at some point that it needed to be hidden from the world that came after. And it stayed hidden for nearly 12,000 years until a shepherd noticed a stone in the dirt. Klaus Schmidt died in 2014. Less than 10% of the site has been excavated. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed at least 16 more enclosures still sealed beneath the hill, and similar sites have begun emerging from neighboring hilltops across the region. The people who built them are gone. Their language is gone. Their names for the foxes and vultures and lions are gone. What remains is the stone, the carvings, and the question there. Architecture asks of everyone who stands among the pillars now. We did not invent civilization. We inherited it from someone who buried it. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.